Hi everyone, welcome to another video. Today I'm starting a new series on the channel called Trope Talk. And for the first episode of this new series, I'm going to be covering the common sci-fi trope of space fighters. Typically, a space fighter is a small one-man vessel that is typically very nimble and can be very fast. Starfighters or space fighters are, as I said before, a fairly common sight in most science fictions that are set in space. And depending on the universe, they have varying degrees of usefulness in combat and often used for a wide variety of uses depending on the universe. Everything from flanking maneuvers, surgical attacks on space stations and planetary installations, or as a short-range reconnaissance platform and for patrol duty in distant sectors. Typically, these ships are dependent on a larger carrier to traverse long distances, although in some universes, fighters can be outfitted with faster than light speed capability or may have a built-in faster than light speed drive in some form, although typically this range is relatively short. Most of the time, a space fighter, starfighter, will behave like a regular fighter aircraft would in an atmosphere, and they may even resemble a modern aircraft to a certain extent. Namely, they will at least have wings that can be very useful for mounting weapons on. And also, a lot of space fighters can fly an atmosphere and can possibly even enter an atmosphere and go into space. Although, in a more realistic setting, most fighters may just be nothing more than a collection of engines and guns with a lot of thrusters mounted all over them, and will be completely unaerodynamic because they are designed to operate solely in space. So why would they need to fly in an atmosphere in the first place? Often or not, if a story does involve space fighters, the protagonist will be a fighter pilot and will be protected by plot armor, although the danger of their profession will be shown on screen by the number of enemy pilots that are killed and the number of red shirts that are killed in every engagement and throughout the course of the war. And the protagonist will be very good at flying spacecraft, namely space fighters. And the reason given is the fact they are a skilled pilot, most likely an ace. They are naturally gifted, namely they're very good at flying a small spacecraft, and they actually have a history of flying small spacecraft at breakneck speeds. And at the same time, they'll probably be cocky, somewhat hot-headed, or may have a psychological issue. And they might, depending on the story, the pilot might actually have a mentor who could be their commanding officer, a grumpy old drill sergeant, or a more experienced fellow pilot who sees the potential of this young pilot and thinks that they could do better. Now, I'm also going to cover some examples of this trope in the next section of the video, and I'll also discuss the usefulness of starfighters in general. The usefulness of a starfighter largely depends on the universe itself and the rules set by the writers. This can be summed up on a scale where at one end you've got Star Wars, space simulator games such as Wing Commander, etc. And these franchises will typically make the space fighter an essential part of any given fleet, with battles being won and lost on the employment of starfighters and what kind of fighters are being used in the battle, and how the fighters are being used. Most of the battles fought in Star Wars, for example, have been won by the actions of starfighters and their pilots, namely the Battle of Yavin and the Battle of Endor, which had both Death Stars, a massive planet-destroying superweapon, destroyed by a couple of starfighters and the Millennium Falcon. Also in Star Wars, the largest capital ship can be destroyed or disabled by a starfighter. For example, in the Battle of Scarif of the current Star Wars canon, an Imperial-class Star Destroyer was disabled by a group of Y-Wings making a bombing run against it. They used ion torpedoes and rendered the ship completely out of action for the rest of the battle, until it was used as a ramming weapon in a maneuver which destroyed it, its sister ship, and the shield gate. In both Legends and canon, the Executor was destroyed by 3 starfighters, 2 of which blew up the center dome on the bridge, and then the 3rd rammed into the bridge, taking advantage of a gap in the shields, which made the ship lose control and smash into the second Death Star. In the Wing Commander franchise, there are a number of missions which feature you destroying large Kilrathi warships, and at the end of the first game, you fly a mission with a squadron of starfighters against a fully armed Kilrathi starbase called a Starpost, which was destroyed not by a combined attack involving many ships and multiple fighters, but by a single squadron, which flew through a gap in the base's defences and then destroyed it, which then made a quick escape. And then at the end of the war, a lone fighter, flown by the player, destroyed the Kilrathi home planet using a special bomb. And in the same story in later games, there would be a starfighter that was massive, had a cloaking device, namely invisible, that could dogfight everything and win, almost every time, especially when the ship was flown by the protagonist. On the end of the scale, there are universes that don't feature starfighters for some reason, or if they do, they are pretty much useless and are often just nothing more than cannon fodder. In most of these universes, the combat is ship to ship, and instead of space fighters, small fast attack vessels will serve as the small fast attack ship analog. These would typically serve as an analog to gunboats and torpedo boats. The next well-known science fiction franchise, Star Trek, is particularly famous for this style of combat. However, Star Trek does make mention of starfighters in its various books, comics, novels, and reference guides, and in a couple of episodes of DS9, we see starfighters. However, typically, most of the engagements fought in Star Wars is typically ship to ship, even large-scale battles. A universe that doesn't use starfighters at all is the Expanse universe. And this is due to the fact that the Expanse universe is highly realistic. And as a result, even the smaller ships typically have a small crew. And just in general, given the high degree of realism, a space fighter wouldn't be able to travel very far due to the fact that it wouldn't actually have a very large engine to begin with, would be too small to mount the magical technology Epstein drive, and just in general, most of the large warships have very good point defense capability. Namely, their point defense grids consist of multiple Gatling guns, ranging from 30mm to 40mm. And there are a number of vessels in the universe that are designated as frigates and destroyers. However, these ships really are torpedo boats, gunboats, and torpedo gunboats. However, these ships, when working in tandem, can overpower large capital ships. And during a battle between the Amon-Ra class stealth frigate and the Martian Congressional Naval Flagship, which is a massive state-of-the-art battleship, and was the flagship of the Martian Congressional Navy, the 6 Amon-Ras were able to overpower the Donager, cripple it, and then stage a boarding action against it. And typically, the most common in-universe name for these small attack ships is gunship. Although, in one episode, the Morgan-class patrol destroyer was referred to as a fast attack boat. Most science fiction properties come somewhere in the middle of this usefulness scale. In Battlestar Galactica, more specifically the Ronald D. Moore version, the Vipers which are the space fighters in this universe, and the Cylon Raiders and larger capital ships typically work in tandem. A common colonial tactic, for example, is for a battlestar to pull up a flag screen which establishes a perimeter from which a battlestar can launch an initial wave of Vipers while thinning out the enemy squadrons and destroying any incoming ordnance. This tactic would give Battlestar, at least initially, the numbers advantage. And a Cylon base ship relies on its raider squadrons first as a means of attack and as defense, as they only really have standard missile capabilities and cannot defend themselves against any sort of attack at short range or any incoming ordnance. In the Babylon 5 universe, a number of factions use space fighters as a means of reconnaissance, attack, and defense. And almost every major nation's navy, large capital ship, can carry a number of fighters aboard. The most popular of these craft is the Earth Alliance Star Fury, which is quite possibly one of the most realistic fighter designs I've ever seen for a sci-fi fiction universe set in space. In almost every major battle in the universe, and in the show, and in the TV movies, we rarely see the Star Fury being used. In Season 1 in particular, we see some rather creative uses of a Star Fury. One universe that does use starfighters off and on is the Stargate universe. And in fact, we are introduced to a starfighter quite early on. That, of course, being the Gold Death Glider. But it is primarily used as an atmospheric attack craft. And when it does fly in space is when the writers decided to do so. Namely, when SG-1 needed to escape a doomed Gold mothership. The Tal'Ri have the F-302, which gets far more use. In Season 6, it saves an SGC base by using its hyperdrive to bypass the shields on the Gold System Lord Anubis' super mothership. It then flies through the defences, avoids the point defence cannons, and fires off 2 missiles which destroys and disables the primary weapon. Later on in Stargate Atlantis, both the Wraith Dart and the F-302 play a minor role in the battle against the Pegasus Galaxy replicators by managing to do some damage against one of the ships being used by the replicators. At the very least, it was the F-302s that did the damage, and there are a couple of other examples of the Wraith Darts being used in space. Although, one example of a completely very useful starfighter, which is completely overpowered, is Andromeda's Slip Fighter, which is quite possibly one of the most overpowered fighters, or ships in general, I've seen in science fiction. A Slip Fighter can carry Nova Bombs, which in the Andromeda universe is a weapon that can blow up an entire star system. And they can also destroy Commonwealth cruisers and other large capital ships relatively easily. There are plenty of other examples in media, but that would take too long to list them and describe how the fighters are used. And in science fiction, anime, and manga, based on what I've seen, typically the job of a space fighter is done by giant robots, which are just as comfortable of operating in space as they are operating on the ground. And then, playing to the rule of cool, they can actually transform into a fighter, which is actually very cool. However, that's just largely for the rule of cool. Personally, I think space fighters are an interesting trope. It's a good way of showing the costs of war, and is a very good way of showing character development, with the pilot, who is the protagonist, being knocked down or narrowly escaping defeat by an enemy ace, and then through character development they become a better pilot, especially with the help of their mentor. Well, that's the end of that. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Please remember to leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Cheerio!